Hey,
Hi, girls.
Friday.
You got big plans for the weekend?
Yeah, actually, we're gonna go see a musical tomorrow night. We're gonna go see Hades Town, which I saw in New York, but my wife wasn't able to see it, and now it's in the Bay Area. So,
Well, I love live theater, but I don't really like musicals. So,
oh, really?
yeah. Though I did like the Book of Mormon's kind of a musical, right? And
Yeah,
I did like
definitely.
Hamilton too. I liked Hamilton. So maybe I only like really well done musicals.
I think that's a fair
Uh,
rationale.
we saw Little Shop of Horrors a couple weeks ago, um, which I'd never seen before, like live, and it
Mhm.
was really, really good.
I had so for meta folks, I had shared a agenda doc in the Discord server, but I'm going to drop it in the error handling chat. Yeah. Hey,
Yeah, how you
Calvin.
doing? How you doing?
Probably join the Discord.
Let's see if we can get you a link for that.
Hey, Calvin.
Okay. I'll invite people here. Invite people.
Hey, Benoit.
I'll paste it in the chat here. This will be the Discord link. There you go.
Ah, yes. Yes, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Also, just put the doc there. I'm a Zoom noob. Rory, cool. Let's see, who else are we expecting? Everyone seems to be here. Alex, I think, is coming as well. Give it one more minute. Oh, nice. Hey, Matt.
Hello.
I put together a small agenda doc. I just put it in chat here in Zoom. Let's give it one more minute to see if Alex arrives.
He's asking for a password, but the password's in the link, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's in link.
Locked out. Whoa, a brand new transliteration of your name, Andre. Hadn't seen that before. Awesome. Okay. Hey everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be here. I just wanted to take a moment and try to reconcile a little bit or come to some sort of shared understandings about how we want to think about client-controlled nullability with the sort of potential of a true nullability, true schema nullability, future. And oh, I see. Got it. Thanks for reposting. I think this is obviously the right group of folks to do. I really appreciate everyone making time to do it, especially as I think we sort of are ramping up to GraphQL Conf. So my thought was I could give a brief overview. I suspect most of you have read the post, but I thought it'd be good to go over and just give a chance for questions generally about the like, I don't know if I'd even call it a proposal, just the like direction. And then maybe we could take some time to discuss the like unsolved pieces of it, which I think will maybe help us understand sort of the timeline we might expect something like this to be possible or not. And then just have some discussion about if or how this will influence how we think about client controlled nullability. Yeah, so maybe before I start, any other like sort of meta level questions or suggestions? Right. So the true nullability schema idea came about as Itamar and Ryan and Matt and I were sort of looking at this idea of having Relay, or more generally just smart clients, make more use of the structured error metadata that the GraphQL server returns. So specifically, rather than simply returning null for a field that is in an error state, we could shield the user from that error value, or at least give them the ability to explicitly handle the error case as distinct from the like true null case. And so Relay is a normalized, uses a normalized cache. And so our implementation there is basically, as we normalize the response into our store, we mark fields that are in an error state as being as such in our store. And then when you read them out again, you can then error on read. You have some optionality there. And we also are exploring a directive to allow you to, rather than Relay just throwing an error, if you try to read a field that is in an error state, giving that back to you as like a result type, where it's like a union of the true value or an error value. And so once you have that sort of result type, you can then distinguish between, hey, I got null because, or I got an error and I got null. Those are now two separate things, which previously was not an option for Relay. And as far as I'm aware, not an option in any even other smart clients. I don't know if there are any other clients today that make more extensive use of that error response. So that was our like original small project. I'm sure Itamar and Ryan can attest that it has not been particularly small. But it got us thinking that now we have a client-defined way to shield error values from the user. And that removes our reliance on the server to shield these error values from the user. So today, part of the spec's goal, as I read it, is to ensure that the data portion of the response by itself is always type safe. And that's where the null bubbling comes in, says, okay, we can't just delete, like this non-nullable field is in error. We can't just omit it because that's not type safe. That doesn't conform to the schema. So we'll bubble nulls until it is. And now, hey, presto, we're schema compatible and it's type safe. And I think that's great, and especially useful for like simple clients or like naive sort of implementations of a client. I think what we're now imagining is taking that up a step and saying, well, we're not going to guarantee that. Like, what if the server didn't have to guarantee that, and instead could make a weaker guarantee, which is that taken together, the data portion of the response and the error portion of the response, that together is type safe. So if your client can shield you from ever encountering a field that has been marked as error in the metadata, then we don't need to perform null bubbling. And this is especially good for, like, I guess aside, this is especially important for clients that do maintain a normalized store, because null bubbling is not just destructive within the request, but then it can end up with sort of bad data getting written into the normalized store. So once you say, okay, well, we're not so worried about null bubbling being destructive, now the need to type everything as nullable is also removed, right? Because the reason that we opt for this default nullability is to give resilience, right? The more nullability you have in your schema in a world with null bubbling, the more resilience you have, the smaller the impact of any one individual resolver error. So if we can now say, okay, we don't need to do null bubbling, we now don't need to do pervasive nullability. We can type the fields in our schema as just, they have the nullability that the resolver function has. If they don't ever expect to return null, then they should be non-nullable. And now that that's modeled in the schema, the client can say, look, I never expect this thing to be null except in an error case. And that's handled out of band, right? There's some other mechanism for shielding me from errors. So that's the big pitch. And yeah, I'll pause for questions here start with Matt. Oh, I think you're muted.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, this isn't so much a question, more of an assertion. But basically, it would be ideal for us to end up with the schema, the server schema type definition, and the JSON response format not necessarily being one-to-one, where your JSON object could have a null when your schema is typed as non-null in the case where there's an error in the errors array.
Yeah, but I want to say that that's true if you consider just the data portion of the response.
Right.
But if you, I think one thing that has helped me is to really think of the GraphQL response as being, rather than being a data portion and an errors portion, it's really just a single tree. And the fact that we keep the metadata aside, the error metadata aside, is just like an encoding thing in order, because you can't really express that in JSON otherwise.
Right.
So like you can imagine that you would like walk the data portion and insert special errors at those locations.
Basically, it would be ideal if the spec was not tied, if we could move the spec to be even less tied to JSON, the response format, and then describe, so we could describe, oh, any field could have an error state. When it is in this error state, this is the format that you would expect if you were using a JSON response, rather than yeah.
Yeah, and even if we don't opt for a change to the spec language, at least that mental model I think is helpful to say, like, okay, taken together, this thing represents a single tree where some nodes are in an error state. Young?
A little bit related to that, I keep thinking about, we keep talking about server and client distinctions, and I think that is because the spec itself doesn't actually make a distinction between between the client and server. So maybe the way that we should think about this is, oh, that's like GraphQL as a service still keeps that kind of type safe kind of response, but that is maybe we create like a separate maybe subspec that kind of specifies the implementation detail between like server and client communication. And because I think if we kind of try to say, oh, like we are changing how the server communicates with the client, and then now we need to introduce that concept to the spec, and we need to change the kind of the past 10 years of a GraphQL kind of services that's built on top of it, I think that will make it very kind of hairy. So maybe we treat it as a kind of, the way I thought about it is like, oh, it's like an implementation detail that other smart clients can implement, and the smart servers that kind of expect to only work with the smart clients can implement, is kind of how I thought about it. But
Yeah, I mean, we could add a schema level directive that says at only null on error, which gets us this oh, any client now knows that any client that supports only null on error, right? So yes, in the schema for old clients or whatever, this field is typed as nullable and they handle the nullableness of it correct, in the old way, but anybody that like we want clients to be able and to be thinking about how to handle these error cases. And we want them to be able to treat only null in the case of error as a non-nullable field. And we also want them to be able to treat fields that can be in an error state, but also be nullable as like distinct in some way. Like treat those cases as distinct. And yeah, I think you're hitting exactly what makes moving on this a little bit tricky, which is that like it is, if we just said, oh, the spec is moving forward and now exclamation point in your schema means in fact that the field like can come back null in the data, like that's actually tough.
I wonder if it really is actually, because like we're saying, we're thinking about this as like, okay, we're going to now say there's an expectation of what the server does and an expectation of what the client does. And there's now like a joint responsibility, and the server must do some things, the client must do some things, and then only taken together are they like a valid thing. But I wonder, like, really the only primitive we need to move on this, I think, at the most simplistic level is like a flag to say, hey, server, don't perform null bubbling. And what is different there is just like the point we made earlier, right? Which is you now must consider both errors and data in order to be type safe. Like the spec could just say like that's a mode that you can opt into, and like there's a different expectation in the response that you can't just look at the data and expect it to be type safe. Now, smart clients can then use that to offer a specific contract to their users, which is like, you know, I'm going to generate types for you that say you're never going to get an error. I think that might be a viable path forward, which doesn't necessarily require us to like specify a server and a client. But maybe then I guess the only concern I would have is that now the contract that the client has with its user is maybe not necessarily a contract that's specified in the spec, and something that they're sort of coming up with on their own.
To be fair, I think it's been true for a while that like Relay essentially has a spec on top of the spec. And I like part of the idea, like part of what we've been trying to do over the years is push some of those Relay as a spec ideas down to GraphQL the spec, because they're actually useful. Like they'd be useful even if the server execution was aware of these concepts. And the tough part is like the migration story.
Isn't that essentially what CCN was kind of doing? You have to infer a new spec because you're changing the types. So it's essentially the same kind of thing, but yeah.
There is a potential world where truly we do just like there might be so many features that we want to push that there's a world where like features and syntax changes or whatever that we do actually want to version GraphQL, the language, where like, oh, if you're pre V2, then you don't get these syntax. And we need a way to represent servers being in V1 versus V2. I don't know.
Well, I think this actually dovetails with the next agenda items that I have, which I think sort of dig into some of the other limitations or challenges with this approach. So maybe we will just go into those, and that will spark more conversation here. So a second value of a pervasively nullable schema is that, in theory, it allows you to say, okay, hey, I have like these long support windows for my clients. I think we experience this especially at Meta, where we have sort of a very long support window. And I want to remove this code that like provided this field. And so the narrative has been, hey, if your field is typed as nullable, all your clients must be handling that sensibly and dealing with the fact that it might be nullable. You can just start returning null, delete all the code that was backing it, and you can move on with your life and still have legacy clients that are not going to blow up. I think the pressure to encode like destructive assertions in a declarative way, this is at required in relay, the exclamation point in CCN, indicates to me that that's not truly how clients deal with null values, and that in practice they actually do something destructive if they encounter a null value that, or they often will do something destructive if they encounter a null value that they don't anticipate to really be null in practice. And so I think this is a place where we might want to just like do a little reality check, and say like, hey, is this something we've actually, like, maybe we just get anecdotal evidence from people at companies who have tried to do this. Like, is this something you're able to successfully do, to say, hey, like, we don't want to support this field anymore. We can just, hard code it to always return null and move on with our lives? Or is it in practice not really that simple and you do have to kind of support it forever?
Does anyone outside of Meta on this call support GraphQL outside of a JS context? And if so, like, yeah, I guess how long-lived is your support window?
So maybe this is a place where we could reach out to someone else who does, have like a more serious, native, presumably, or other kind of GraphQL use case. Okay, that's cool. We can continue to do that.
Our native Netflix app use GraphQL, but it's only been like about a year or so. And so thus far it's forever, that we've supported fields.
Also, would it be interesting to hear like what public API kind of looks like how that behavior they deal with?
Say that again.
Because I think for Netflix or for Relay's case, because I think there's like strong kind of coupling between like the client and the server, like API development. So then I think that's interesting, but also like to see how the public API developers think about deprecating scenarios.
Yeah, like maybe some GitHub people or something.
Yeah, though I think GitHub decided to deprecate their GraphQL. Yeah.
Okay, well, I can try to find some folks to follow up with there. Another concern is simple clients. So this gets back to our conversation of like, is this something that's taken as a like the specs stance that there's simply a GraphQL system and rather than a client and a server. And for simple clients who aren't necessarily going to be able to intercept errors at a granular level, and are therefore relying on the data portion on its own being type safe. If the schema does move to a true nullability world where it's expressing the true nullability of fields, the resilience of that response is going to be diminished because there will be fewer nulls in the schema to catch errors. I guess I will like immediately start to bias this conversation by saying like, I wonder if that's maybe just fine, right? Like the simple client use case is good and we should definitely try to continue to support it, but it's probably also the case where resilience is the least important, right? Like if you're using curl or fetch to do your GraphQL, like your setup is presumably more simplistic and you maybe are not as concerned with like, you know, optimizing for a perfectly resilient scenario. Because you will still get some resiliency, right, to the fact that you do have naturally occurring nullable values in your schema.
Is anyone here using like querying GraphQL services that way with a simple client?
Yes.
I guess what does that look like for you?
We have like people who have like C++ tools that feed, say, indexes where they're like querying some GraphQL to update some index, and the query is just like a string in C++ that they feed through and then parse as JSON.
Yeah, and we have some similar use cases. The queries are generally small, but they are often critical. It's just that like the environment you're in isn't, you know, it's not a web browser. You're not bringing in Relay and stuff. So I do struggle about a bit with this. You know, I'd like to think that, oh, you know, if it really matters, use a real client, but I'm not sure that that's the case. You know, but I think that's not necessarily a blocker for this. Because maybe, you know, in those cases, it's okay to you know, not have the bubbling and, you know, like need to check for null more. And so if you can have that behavior even with a simplistic, we'll call it, client, you know, maybe that's okay.
Yeah, I actually think even with the more simplistic clients, like not having null bubbling is still probably usually the correct choice, where all they should do is if there's an errors array, just like, what the heck, I don't know how to handle this, right?
Right, you don't want to write error like nulls due to error into your search index. That's not a good idea.
Yeah. And that's actually probably a preferred thing, but at the same time, or the real struggle we would have is how, luckily, I think for us, most of these cases are probably not publicly exposed, so they aren't as long-lived as our publicly exposed clients. But yeah, like the default, I think, of not having null bubbling on error is better. Story is still painful.
If this behavior is opt-in behavior, then we don't really need to think about this, right?
You do in a way, because it's opt-in from the client, but it does require that the schema
To change.
be updated to have a significantly fewer nulls.
That's true. Yeah.
And actually, maybe that's a segue into the next topic, which is
Just real quick,
Yeah.
at least in theory, that swap over is an non-breaking change, yeah?
In that direction, yes.
uh,
The-
yeah,
it's the
non-breaking,
other
except that it will break a lot of clients.
Sort of. Going from null to non-null should not. It's only going from null to non-null except on error should be non-breaking. It's the opposite direction, where if you have a bunch of non-null fields already, and you no longer want those non-null fields to bubble their errors, that's where you would encounter potential issues. For
Right.
us, that's actually, we only have like less than 1%-ish of our fields as being in that case. So
I mean,
for
it's
yeah.
non-breaking in terms of the schema, right? It doesn't cause old clients to get non-type safe data back, but it is a breaking change in that it will break a bunch of things, right? Because errors that previously were captured in a relatively, imagine you have some field deep in your query that all was errors, and it would just be like, oh, that field is null. Now you make everything non-nullable, and now like your entire app falls over.
Yeah, so it'll probably break old versions of your app if you go through and like, really put the true nullability of fields
Right.
throughout your graph.
Got it. I would also be curious to find out, I don't know if y'all have like quick access to this code you're talking about, but Matt and Stefan, if the use cases that you're talking about, if they would break if this change were to happen.
Jordan just pointed out the case. So actually, yeah, Jordan pointed out the case that actually we would have clients. We have clients that anytime they see an error at all, they just throw out the whole query. And so basically, regardless, adding an error in the errors array, where it formerly was null or where it formerly bubbled up, and we handled that specific instance of error.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
It's like it shouldn't really cause problems, but it will in practice because our clients are not quite smart enough.
Got it. Okay. Nope, that's true. Thanks. Appreciate
I
it.
think that's pretty common in practice to, throw out the whole response when you see errors, unfortunately.
Yeah, that also might not be like in practice, this probably isn't that bad because most of the time there's not actually a field that has been nulled due to an error. I might be wrong. I could actually, but yeah, in practice, I think like it might, for us, for instance, it might increase by like 1% or something, the number of requests that are failing on, say, 6-month-old versions of the app. But
which isn't nothing. That's a lot of people.
it's not nothing. A lot of people, but also we have that much happen due to other random breaking changes also.
Yeah.
And it improves future resiliency. So it's like it's a hard balance.
Got it.
Calvin?
Is it correct to say that this idea of true nullability isn't completely viable until people start adopting like more nullability in their schema design? Is that right?
It's no, I think
If you have currently defined schemas that are everything is nullable, and then true nullability, like is there much use to that? No. So this idea of like people changing the schema design like has a very long tail, and especially when it's just something like a best practice, the spec can't enforce that, right? So is there more value in having something like true nullability combined with CCN, where you can have the client begin to change the schema on top of things? Like, is that the short-term evolution of this with the long-term goal that we change people's best practices?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think like for a perfect migration strategy, what you would really want is a schema which tells you two things. Like, here's a nullability that I will use for error bubbling, and legacy clients can continue to use that. And here's a nullability that you can use with your modern clients that will do true schema nullability. And like, you can switch between the two, and like clients can see two different pictures of the world depending upon like which execution mode they want to use. That seems like not something we want to put in the schema. But like internally, we may explore that. For example, like we may say, hey, we're going to slap a directive on our fields where the actual resolver implementation is non-nullable. And we're going to have a runtime, flag that says, hey, we're going to opt out of null bubbling. And like that, I think would be enough for Relay to move forward with the world, and start to offer its users internally, a better world. But it's pretty gross, especially something to be specified would be pretty gross. Stephen?
So first, I really like this direction. This is basically expanding the scope of client-controlled nullability to be, let's fix nullability in GraphQL, which is really what client-controlled nullability was getting at. It's just a specific way to do that. And I think we're going in a direction where we can distinguish between handling failure and expressing the semantics of our data. That this field is actually optional. Null is a completely valid value for this particular field because we might not have a phone number for this person or whatever. The nullability, the way it is designed in GraphQL right now, because the best practice, if you want to be resilient, if you want to use nullability to express fallibility, that this field could fail. This field could contain a bug, and so if you want to say, okay, all the fields that could contain a bug and could ever be null, then that gets us to this world where we just never use the bang. So if we go down this road, first, I think the obvious challenge is that it's a big paradigm shift, and so even if we can make it like non-breaking, it's it's going to be a big mental shift at the very least, no matter how we do it. But setting that aside, if we were going to design, like, how would, with everything we've learned over the years of using GraphQL, how would we do it today? One of the features of GraphQL's original non-null was that it's a bang instead of a question mark, which is counterintuitive for most people coming to it, because this is something that you're going to use rarely. If we change the semantics, then this becomes kind of the opposite, where rarely in your graph, or sometimes in your graph, you have fields that actually are intended to be null sometimes, but then you have a lot of fields that we expect to have values for unless something goes wrong. And so would we then do the syntax differently? Would we use a question mark, which is maybe more intuitive for most people coming from languages that have some sort of optionality? And if we were to do that, would that also give us this kind of two worlds thing? Like, you're in a question mark in the schema world or a bang. And so then the bang, maybe we even rename it. It's not non-null. It's this is required to be there. So that's required. And then also clients can express required, and clients probably should be the ones to express required because it's contextual. It depends on what canvas you're talking about, whether you really want all or nothing. And so in the true nullability world, you would expect a schema that probably doesn't have bangs so much, but has some question marks on some fields. But an existing schema would have some some bangs in it, and maybe we don't have to change that semantics of the bang, because in graphs where we've already been really concerned with resilience, we just don't use it very much, and so we just keep it that way. and basically we'd be adding, just adding this new concept that is just the semantic nullability. And if we wanted to make it a little bit stronger, the thing that would be a breaking change, but make it a little bit stronger, is say that if you don't have a question mark, then there should be an error if there's not a null. But that would be, more breaking.
My sense is that we've talked about client control nullability, and that totally made sense to me. When I would like, and I think as I've thought about this more, the distinction between errors and true null, like once you start to imagine a world where like you do know the true nullability of a field, the only time it's going to be null is when it's an actual null, and that null is expected to be returned from the server. The value of the bang is like, why would you ever do that, right? Like it's kind of your job as the client to handle that. And like, it's not going to be so pervasive that you need a declarative syntax to deal with it. Like your client code like really ought to do something sensible in a thing that the server is expecting to send you some amount of the time. I mean, certainly there are like edge cases where you're like, oh, I know that this is like a logged in user, and so it should have a username or whatever it is. Like, I certainly you do see assertions in normal languages, but I suspect that not to the degree that it would need to be codified as like a declarative syntax.
I think that like Stephen talked about two cases. There's a actual nullability, like the data can be null, or there's a fallibility that the data can fail for some reason. But then there's also third case, and I think we put too much, and this is kind of a case that I probably didn't talk about a lot in CCN, but to Benoit's point, the schema itself maybe cannot express the data that well. And I think there are limitations, and I guess I probably need to think through like what those cases are. Or the schema just be ill-designed, and like it's so then I need an escape hatch as a client developer. And I think that's a third case that cannot be they cannot be dealt with using the truth nullability. Like we cannot just say, oh, the schema is a source of truth for everything, because I think schema can be outdated or just built on like wrong assumptions.
I guess, so I think that is the key reason why we want CCN, is like that it is difficult to make the right decision in your server design. So you default to the one that's most resilient. And then in the future, you discover we don't need this resiliency. Or for this specific product, we don't need this resiliency, right? And one of the questions I guess we might have is, in a world where changing a type from null to non-null and changing it from non-null to null, if we lived in a world where neither of those were breaking changes, if we enforced that clients must have a means of handling either of those states, because we no longer have error bubbling, or we no longer have null bubbling. If that was the case, then it makes it so that the schema changes on the server are a lot cheaper. Would we still want client-controlled nullability? And if so, is like the value add of it high, or is it like relatively? It still might be high, honestly, because there might be surfaces where you really never want this thing to be null, but in a completely other surface, it's like, it's fine if there's an error there, or it's fine. Like we can handle the situation where it's null. And so the schema has to be like, anytime you're unioning two product use cases for the same field, you always must default to the most open one.
Yeah, I think you're right that there are places where like a poor schema design could lead you to that world, right? Where you're like, oh, really, it should have been an interface with two different implementations, one of which was nullable and one of which wasn't. Okay, we can work around, like now we have this tool we can use. But I feel like we are overemphasizing how common that would be because we've conflated it with this error case where like, oh, we're thinking about resiliency here. And now like if you like scrub away, it's like actually all those resiliency concerns are like in the past and we never had to think about them. Now it's like, oh yeah, we just like fucked up we just messed up our schema. Like, yeah, it happens, but like probably not so much that you need to bake it into the language that like we expect you to be like messing up your schema so much of the time that we need to give you this special like terse syntax to work around it all the time. Like probably your code can just have some assertions in it.
I will say if we manage to get true schema nullability worked out, we will owe a very huge debt to the CCN work that like managed to really dig in and uncover that was like the true root problem that we needed to wrap all of our collective minds around.
It is kind of curious that it's taken us this long to reach this point. Like we kind of, paddled along for 2 years, just sort of under the assumption that what GraphQL was already doing was correct and good.
Yeah, it's
or at
particularly
least that it's immutable.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was particularly ironic for me because I joined the Relay team to work on @required. And that was like my but also I think another thing to CCN's credit is like it was actually the question mark that like connected the dots. It was like, wait, we can opt out of null bubbling? That changes everything. From Relay's perspective. And so it was that like the idea that the client could make a different decision in terms of what it wants from null bubbling was the sort of and the error handling. Like, okay, if a client can actually handle errors explicitly and we can opt out of null bubbling, wait, that's a different world.
Yeah, I'm not mad if this if this manages to make its way through and CCN kind of peters off. This seems obviously like preferable. I don't know if like the technical steering committee and the maintainers can be sold on it, but if they can, then we'll see.
Stephen,
And even in so in this hypothetical world where we have we have the ability to express true nullability, it does seem like @required as implemented in Relay as a client side thing is still useful, right?
I don't think so.
No,
I think like you will look at well, if we introduce true schema nullability, right? We'll like see like, hey, look, here's a bunch of fields that have @required on them that that are now non-nullable. So we can just delete all those, right? There'll be some number left that are like, here's a destructive assertion on a field that really can be nullable. Look, our whole idea here was like resiliency. We should probably like revisit all of those. And like, I mean, if you really mean it, like, the cases we talked about were like, oh, you have a botched your schema design or, there's something else, but like probably each one of those is a bug that we should go revisit. Because we were flying blind, and same with CCN, right? Like you're slapping these things all over the place. You're like, probably this thing is really in the resolver actually non-nullable, but like, that's like my intuition. I don't actually know. The schema didn't tell me.
So @required has the log case, which I think is a minority of usage.
Yes.
And I feel like @required log ends up still potentially being like, we will see clients do that because it is basically an admission on their end that like something weird has happened here. We had a bug, we think we resolved it, throw this log in to see like what the heck is actually happening. but that's like a short-term thing, and I don't think CCN, like at required log, is not the equivalent of CCN anyways.
One exercise I would like to take on is to reconfigure meta schema building to give you a true nullability schema, and then reconfigure required to throw an error if you try to require a field that is, or to like see like what percentage of those requires are just trying to achieve what CCN was trying to achieve, which is like, look, just please, I want to deal with it as if it, like, if it's an error, throw here, not, you know, not don't give me null. And I think that will be an interesting number to look at, and see like what percentages would just get deleted, which percentage of these are actually like pretty dangerous, and which percentage of these like are like logging something else.
Because just point of clarification for relay, like the written schema is the output of something else, right? It's not handwritten, but that something else has the true nullability in it.
Yeah, so it's right. We have PHP functions and classes that have like essentially we end up needing to wrap a bunch of, or I think actually by default we enforce that the functions return nullable, even if yeah, even in the case where the actual like underlying PHP function is non-nullable. So yeah, we basically hide that nullability, and then we generate the schema based off of those function definitions.
Got it. No, yeah, that sounds like a good experiment. That'd be cool.
Yeah, I think, Jordan, I think we could do this with adding directives at the schema level. We would have like a directive that's like only, right, only null if throws. And then ideally we'd fix our clients, all of our clients. We'd need to get all of that, not just relay, to handle those. And then we could attempt to like possibly get rid of the bang entirely and have an at, you know, at basically migrate the bang to that and migrate a bunch of our nullable fields to that.
Yeah, I suspect we at Meta will probably just find a way to go down this path. We have the sort of integration to do it. And hopefully that can also provide signal back to the working group in terms of like what the challenges really are. Stephen?
No, I want to poke a little bit more at, is there any value in the client deciding that for this canvas, for this fragment, I want the bubble up behavior basically, because that was what led us to originally add like an at non-null to our server was, clients were moving to TypeScript and turning on strict checking, and they wanted to be able to generate types that had not null in the types. And in some canvases and some cases, they didn't need the resiliency we were baking into our schema. And so that eliminates a lot of code on the client if they can say, okay, for this object, we're gonna make everything non-null. What would we say to that, to that use case in the case where we can, we're expressing the true nullability in the schema, we don't do any bubbling up then on the server, if I'm understanding correctly. Is there a way we could still allow clients to generate types that don't have null?
So sorry, I'll just jump really quick because like I think we're proposing that the server supports both modes. So that like if they say, hey, I don't care about resiliency, I care mostly about just getting some sensible types. Like your schema now shows you the sensible types. You can have two options. You can just leave the existing null bubbling behavior. Nulls will bubble further and be more destructive because they'll have to go all the way to some actual null value. And that would work fine. I think this is actually the case that is best supported, right? Like they just get what they want by default now instead of having to ask for it explicitly.
Also, to your question explicitly, Stephen, I think the error handling, like if we had good error handling, then you could say, okay, handle any error from any of these fields at the fragment level. And then like, so any accessors are like, we can generate the types so that any accessors are non-null. And like anything, anytime we read an error in the errors array, the fragment level handler or the fragment level model constructor or whatever handles it.
Yeah.
And also, I guess if the absolute number of nullable fields go down in the schema, then it's like the problem that you encounter that probably goes down. That's why I think is that like the true nullability schema decreases the just like the usefulness of the CCN. But I guess there's also the timing aspect of true nullability schema, like CCN, and I guess this is more about like how we plan to go forward from here, but like, you know, yes, maybe Meta can like try to do this and then like really can implement this, but then, you know, what about like Apollo client or other clients that don't have access to that? And what about like the teams that don't have resources to implement this new behavior on the client side or the server side? How do we help them? And maybe like if we can like help them for the next kind of 2 to 3 year time frame and then switch over to true nullability, that maybe that's still the value of the CCN as like a stopgap measure, is kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, we might at Meta, we might find that we need something like CCN in order to do this migration. That's a very strong potential.
Which
case.
parts of CCN are you thinking about, Matt?
So specifically, we might need to have basically a short term where we don't change the server response format necessarily, but we in our code gen, we generate basically error handling bits for any field marked or for any type field marked with at only null on error. And then we might need to, and then like, so step one of that is like, oh yeah, the client needs to handle and actually look in the errors array and things become non-null. But then the next bit may actually be like, I guess the CCN bit we'd need might actually be the question mark for specifically for us. Lists are non-nullable today. I think we end up always just converting it to an empty list on the server, so it's not actually destructive, but it could potentially be. And we have a few, especially with some of the clients that we've started, some of the new people that we started onboarding, there are people that have more non-nulls in their schema. And like we might need, especially a question mark migration.
But would it need to be like a CCN style question mark, or could it just be a separate execution mode that's per query?
Unclear to me what is required as of today.
I mean, I think, Young, I think you hit on exactly the question, right? It's like, how long is something like this going to take to get through? And is it worth it to say, hey, we let's offer CCN in the meantime? We're really close. Like we could get that out the door pretty quickly. And I think the only reason not to do that is like, if you think that exclamation, like when we get to, if we get to a true nullability schema world, like is exclamation point going to be an anti-pattern? And like, you're going to have to lint against it because you're like, you shouldn't do it. It's destructive. It's going to be a bad idea. You're going to hurt the world when you add that every time.
Or should it be something that is in the spec, but only implemented in clients, so it doesn't actually cause bubbling up in the server?
Right.
Yeah, like imagine like you have a client like that we build right now, like a Android client that has exclamation mark now. Like how does that impact down in the future? Yeah, something to think about, I guess.
So we're at time. I really appreciate all this like conversation. I hope that you will, as you all continue to think about this and look around from your unique vantage points, like please provide feedback on that post. One thing that I think would be really good, like, to accelerate us getting there, is like for other smart clients to start look at explicit error handling. And I think Ryan, Itamar, and myself would love to be available to share what we're learning on Relay as we implement this. We've spent a lot of time thinking about it and talking to a lot of different people. But I think that's going to be a prerequisite either way. And even if we don't do true schema nullability, it's like a good thing. I think clients like would all benefit from having something like that. Just for the like, or if only to say, hey, look, you can now tell that a null is actually a null and an error is actually an error, which is like a thing that in retrospect, it's almost crazy that like so much code has had to just blindly be like, I don't know, maybe you have no friends, or maybe there was an error on the server. Who knows? And also, like, if clients do experience trouble in implementing something like that, if there are more troubles there than we foresee, then we may say, actually, we can't really go down this true schema nullability path. Like, it's just not like that problem is a prerequisite to get it solved. So that would be my like call to arms. Like, I hope we can start like getting that into smart clients, because it will be a prerequisite, I believe.
Who's going to GraphQL Conf? Y'all should talk to some people about this there and see, what users of GraphQL think about this. I think it'll be helpful.
And
Cool.
we have scheduled CCN meetings. It seems like there's more to discuss here. Do we want to kind of have this be kind of a continued direction that we discuss there?
Yeah, sure. I think it makes sense to I don't know. I mean, Young's the one who's volunteered to do the work. So if you don't think it's worth it, then don't do it. But I think it probably makes sense to at least finish the spec stuff and keep pushing that along for now.
Agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is CCN getting even to stage 2, stage 3, like, is probably a net good thing, regardless that people have it, they're experimenting with it, people are trying to use it. Even if it doesn't quite make it to the spec, it will, like, people's experiences with using CCN and having the ability to use CCN because it's well defined, and we're pretty sure if we do CCN, this is what we would do. Like, that's not necessarily a negative thing.
Yeah, I think the main question here, and I forgot who said it, is like, if people start using CCN, does that make a transition to true schema nullability more difficult? And if it doesn't, then I don't think there's a good reason to stop with CCN necessarily. Yeah.
I don't think it makes the transition more difficult. It might just be a more dangerous end state if we have both. In that, like, you sort of have this like very terse, attractive looking syntax that really clients would be better not to use.
Yeah.
And a more complex GraphQL.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. If anyone is at GraphQL Conf, please reach out. I'd love to meet up and say hi.
Thanks a bunch. Later.